We're very happy and lucky to have Laurent with us again this week, where we'll be discussing the future of our technological economy and how it can be steered in a better direction. So again, Laurent will start us off and then we'll discuss.
Perfect. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Roberto. Thanks to all of you guys. So I'm going to share my perspectives on the direction of technology and its choices and its implications. This is very much my sort of personal opinion. I think the things that I shared in the first lecture, I think there was a somewhat of a broader consensus, not by everybody by any means within the economics, and certainly not outside economics. But on this one, I think the issues are certainly less well agreed upon, and there are different sort of ideas. But this has been sort of a very large part of my work over the last almost 3 decades, and so I want to share those. But I also suspect that Danny and Roberto are somewhat sympathetic to what I'm going to say. So differently from the last time, I'm going to also mention and somewhat briefly discuss the main criticisms of this perspective. So okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to organize this as 4 arguments that I believe apply to any technology. Then I'm going to apply these 4 arguments to AI and digital tech that's adjacent to AI. And then I'll go over what I think are 6 counter arguments that apply broadly, but 1 or 2 perhaps more so in the context of AI. Okay. So argument 1 is that technology is highly malleable. If technology is interpreted as application of our scientific knowledge in order to solve problems, this, I believe, has to be true by definition, because problems are sort of created by us. They're not well-defined objective things. There could be problems that are related to saving time in certain things or dealing with certain discomforts that may or may not exist. But more broadly, technology can do many, many things, and science can do many, many things. So thinking that, the mobility technology that was embedded in, say, the internal combustion engine could have been developed in just one way, in my opinion, would be a very strong assumption. And there are a lot of instances in which we have evidence that the direction of technology changes from one to another, for example, in the context of energy or in the context of how computer tools are used, et cetera, and I'll give some more examples of those later on. So that's argument number 1, is sort of like the basic foundation. Argument number 2, building on that, is that different ways of developing a given technology, and especially a given technology platform, out of these malleable multitudes of choices, is going to be associated both with different extents of distributional effects, some people winning, some people losing, and also different productivity gains. By different distributional effects, obviously, if the menu of choices out of that malleable bunch include things where you invest in making certain types of factors of production more productive, that would be almost immediate. But also indirect effects are very clear. So if you develop a technology that's very good in, say, protecting boundaries, that's going to help people who have properties to protect. And if, on the other hand, you develop technologies that can be used for overcoming, barbed wire, that could be very good for people who want to invade other people's land. So there are a bunch of ways in which the way that technology is developed is going to lead to different users, and those people who are more favoring one use versus another would also indirectly benefit. And then there are even more higher order general equilibrium effects depending on where society goes, et cetera. But those are sort of potentially as important as well. Productivity effects, what I mean by that is, of course, we touched upon this a little bit in the last lecture that I was here, last session that I was here, But once we define, a notion of productivity like GDP per worked hour or total factor productivity in worked hour, there is no guarantee, of course, that different ways in which you can develop the technology are all going to have equivalent effects. So some of them may be more, may increase our measures of productivity, our measures of other surplus that we care about, and we target more than others. Now here, the argument 3, also I see this almost very natural, is that whatever your societal objective is, it could be some combination of productivity and distributional effects, like you might dislike extreme inequality, or you may want to focus mostly on aggregate productivity, etc. Whatever that objective is, it should be pretty clear that there is no guarantee that the chosen direction is going to satisfy and well perform according to that metric. That also, of course, sort of follows, since we can reasonably agree in different societies on different metrics. Some of them may care about distribution, some of them may not care about distribution. So obviously, a given chosen direction is not going to satisfy all of these metrics. But more importantly, in argument 3 is the notion, which I'm going to develop more in the context of argument 4, that there is no natural self-correction mechanism. That the government or the democratic will may prefer one particular metric, and it's not like an easy process that those signals are naturally going to get transmitted to the innovation process. Innovation is a very complex social phenomenon, and any transmission of values, directions, priorities from other bodies in the political realm to the innovation process is going to be at most weak. That doesn't mean that you cannot try to amplify them. For example, regulations could be one way in which some of those may be tried to be strengthened, but it's not like an automation self-correction mechanism. So I think that generally is not very controversial either, except in one domain. For some economists, and not for everybody, the natural benchmark is to think of technology as being linked to productivity, and there is a presumption that the best productivity enhancing directions are going to be discovered by the market. So that's why argument 4, which is what would the market process or some sort of augmented market process would select in terms of the direction of technology, is particularly important. And that's my argument 4, which is where, in some sense, the rubber hits the road, where we start thinking about what would the market do when confronted with this menu of technologies. I think at least 4 issues are important to discuss in that context. One is productivity. So productivity, not always, but generally, has a direct relationship to profits. So if I'm a firm, whether I'm a monopolist, oligopolist, etc., if I have 2 broadly equivalent technologies that will integrate equally well into my organization, and neither of which create a natural advantage or disadvantage against my rivals, it should be obvious that all else equal, there is a stronger case for me to end up selecting the one that's more productivity enhancing. So if I can as easily invent a screwdriver and a automated, fancy, much more effective automatic screwdriver, I'll have an incentive to go for the automatic screwdriver if I know about it and if I can, at the same cost, develop it. 2, and in contradistinction to that, the real world is more complex. Organizations have business models, and those business models are difficult to change. They have many complementary parts, and they also work well when those organizations have experience and understanding of the tacit knowledge of the business model and the technologies that work in them. So often, they will tend to pursue those that are in line with their business models, and they think they can easily monetize them. And there is ample evidence for this in ways that emerge, for example, from examples where, like, for example, AT&T and others that... Is there a problem? That's okay.
These are all the mics here.
Okay.
That's fine.
So from examples throughout the different types of technologies where you see that it's not often incumbents that have developed a business model that works with existing technologies, existing practices, but sometimes entrants that are not wedded to those business models that can switch to new technologies because there are at least doubts or in reality difficulties in making some technologies work with existing business models. This second channel, of course, intersects very much with market structure. So more monopolistic or oligopolistic market structures where the business models of existing firms are very dominant may be particularly susceptible in not choosing whatever is best in terms of productivity enhancement, et cetera. And again, all of these things I'm going to discuss more in the context of, give more examples in the context of AI. The third element is that, the real world is, market structures work reasonably well in certain domains, but there are also many areas in which there are what economists call pecuniary and non-pecuniary externalities. By non-pecuniary externalities, by economists mean essentially effects on others' payoffs that don't work through market prices. So a classic case of a non-pecuniary externality is, for example, fossil fuel-based carbon emissions that create a variety of negative health effects as well as climate change-related effects. There is no easy market mechanism that without intervention, companies that have already invested in fossil fuels are going to sort of take those external effects into account. So when there are these sorts of external non-pecuniary effects, you would obviously expect that the market mechanism doesn't target the right sort of measure of productivity, where, for example, in the context of energy, you might want to define a productivity that takes into account all of the negative effects that global warming may take in the future on the productive capacities of the economy in question or the world, et cetera. But equally important, there are a lot of pecuniary externalities. For instance, in situations where I have to negotiate wages with my workers, certain technologies that make workers more productive would also need to hire negotiated wages, which means that I don't capture all of the benefits of those, and I might have a preference for a less productive technology, which enables me to capture all of the rents. So in other words, all of the benefits. So in other words, if there's one technology that generates an output increase of $1 million, but half of it goes to workers, and there's another technology that generates an increase of $750,000, and all of it goes to me, I might prefer the second. So, but that's a pecuniary externality because it works not through sort of effects on climate change or pollution, et cetera, but through the market prices, wages that will be negotiated. Finally, less emphasized, but in my opinion, very important, is ideology. So innovation is a forward-looking activity that's driven by sort of your beliefs about what's feasible, what's not feasible, what matters, what are the costs that are supportable, and what are the ones that create a red line and create a no, you shall not go there sort of perspective. So ideology is something that's going to evolve over time as a function of a variety of political, social forces, but as well as economic decisions. And certain ideologies may make firms either excessively focus on some types of technology at the expense of others, or disregard some of the costs that they create, et cetera. So therefore, these four arguments together mean that there is some room for the market economy, out of the many choices available to it, ending up with incorrect directions of research. We may have, for example, overinvested in internal combustion engine and natural gas and so on at the expense of, say, renewables. That's at least a possibility, and then we have to, in each case, investigate that possibility with data, with much more specific case-based decisions as to, what were the feasible forks in the road where more could have been done in order to develop, say, electric cars versus internal combustion engine cars, develop electricity grid that depends on renewables versus natural gas and coal, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not immediately sort of a proposition that says the market necessarily gets it wrong, but it opens the possibility that we have to investigate some of these things. Now, let me apply each one of these four arguments to the AI context. The fact that technology is malleable with AI, I think, is just very obvious to me anyway, because AI is not just a single technology. Even today, when we are at the very beginning of AI, by AI, some people mean good old-fashioned AI, some people mean machine learning, some people mean predictive AI in physical domains, some people mean predictive AI in social domains, some people mean generative AI, and then there are probably about another 10 AI that are going to get invented. But each one of these also can be developed in very different ways. You can use predictive AI in order to, say, monitor people, predicting ahead of time what actions that they're going to take, or you can develop predictive AI in the hands of citizens so that they know when they're going to be snooped or when their communication is going to be interrupted, etc. So there is a vast array of possibilities. Argument two, that these different things are going to have different consequences. I think that also follows. For example, again, in the communication example, if you develop AI as a censoring technology, it's obviously going to have very different effects than if you develop AI to have much better privacy-enhancing tools. But even more so, in especially emphasis of my work, if you develop AI as an automation technology, meaning something that enables algorithms and then combinations of algorithms and machines to perform tasks that were previously done by some worker groups, this is going to have relatively negative effects on those worker groups that are displaced from their tasks. Whereas it's also possible to use AI to develop worker competencies, worker expertise, and especially new tasks for workers. Think of, for example, using AI so that you enable electricians to better diagnose problems and as a result take on more sophisticated tasks and perhaps new tasks that at least most of the electricians, perhaps except the very elite 1 or 2%, could not have even attempted, related to the new electricity grid or new very sophisticated complex machinery, etc. So those have very distributional economic effects. Argument three, no self-correcting mechanism. Well, already I'm talking about very different distributional effects from AI, but if you sort of think of AI right now being monopolized in the hands of just a handful of companies that all seem to be sort of mostly interested in automation and achieving sort of AGI-like things, it already sort of suggests that there is no natural guarantee that they're going to do the right thing, whatever that right thing is, and any self-correction mechanism is not going to be super powerful. So let me then spend a little bit of time on argument four, which is what it is that determines the direction of AI today. So the four things that I mentioned, productivity, business models, and the lock-ins that they create, externalities, and ideology, I think are all visible in the context of AI. Productivity, obviously, I think many of these companies are super valuable and super profit maximizing. They're going to, all else being equal, have a keen eye on seeing which one's going to increase productivity. But at the same time, they have their very set business model. So if you're Google or if you're Facebook, you have a business model that very strongly depends on monetizing data using a variety of forms, but often digital ads. If you're Microsoft, you have a business model that's based on selling software and software-related services. If you are Apple, then it's a combination of platform and hardware. Now, we also see all of these companies are pretty sticky in those decisions. Microsoft has many times attempted getting into other areas, search engines, hardware, et cetera, and each time has been quite unsuccessful. So there is a lot of lock-in in the business models that they have. So that, in particular in the context of AI, creates an incentive, a bias for many of these companies that they're going to try to make this very malleable technology fit into their business model. Some entrants are possibly going to have a more global look and say, well, what other different directions I can go to. But there, the corollary to this that I had mentioned, the market structure mattering, becomes particularly important, because in the current environment, it's very difficult to have small companies compete against these giants and not be acquired and change the market structure. So the combination that it's already a very monopolistic structure, and moreover, each one of these companies is flush with cash and can acquire alternative technologies, either to incorporate into their own platform or leave it aside, also means that this sort of correction mechanism coming from entrants and raw competition is not going to be super powerful. All of the things about externalities and pecuniary and non-pecuniary are, of course, applicable, especially because of automation. Automation demand is natural because automation reduces costs, so managers should like it. But managers in the US especially like automation even more because it weakens the labor movement. In the US, famously, relationship between management and the labor movement is very adversary, much more so than, say, Nordic countries or in Germany. So that creates an even stronger demand on the side of the managers, working exactly through this pecuniary mechanism channel that I mentioned, which managers really love automation. So then you have this sort of synergy between the incentives that companies that sell automation-like software or sometimes hardware services and companies that have demand for automation. On the other hand, say, using technology in order to make your workers more essential is a fraught direction for many managers because it also makes workers more powerful. So unless you have an effective way of mediating that conflict and you can be certain that workers are not going to create a lot of trouble for you, that direction doesn't seem so appealing. And then finally, ideology. I think in my opinion, in my reading, again, this is somewhat subjective, but ideology plays a role in many technology choices, but much more so in the context of AI, because from the very beginning, the AI field was created with a desire to have machines just like humans, autonomous machine intelligence, which then morphed into ideas of artificial general intelligence, which essentially creates an ecosystem of its own where both success internally by AI researchers and externally within the AI community is often judged by how close you are getting to AGI, or softer versions of it where what are the numbers of tasks in which you reach human parity is one of the very strong metrics. So that creates both a practical but even higher level bias in favor of things that automate, things that take machines, make machines become more powerful relative to at least some significant fraction of the workforce and the citizenry. So those together make me think that AI direction is not going to be necessarily optimal, and in fact it's going to be biased in a very specific direction, in a direction that empowers managers and the corporations that control machinery, and sometimes governments that control algorithms and data, such as in the case of China, and is going to put insufficient effort in creating new tasks, creating ways of making workers more productive, ways of making citizens and dissidents more enabled to protect their privacy or engage in their own activities. Now, let me conclude very briefly. I'm not going to go very deep here, but I want to mention 6 counter-arguments. One is that this whole premise is wrong. Technology is not malleable. Technology comes with an already pre-programmed destiny. This technology will have to go this way. Any deviations from that would be at best transitory. Again, I gave you some examples, but there are some people who believe this very much, and you have to take it seriously, and then again, it's an empirical matter. Much more reasonable, in my opinion view is that technology is malleable, but innovation is an organic process. It's a bottom-up process. So even though it's malleable, it's not a choice that we can make from the top. One book, if you want to read, that develops this argument is by Matt Ridley, How Innovation Works, which very nicely describes the decentralized nature in which many technologies were developed, and very much takes this position that nobody can control the direction of technology. Now, in my opinion, Matt Ridley is absolutely right that technology is a very granular bottom-up process, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be controlled, because even something that is bottom-up, high-level incentives are going to create different tendencies for one path versus another being explored. But again, it's an empirical matter to what extent the very strict malleability view versus very strict, it's all organic, the malleability cannot be exploited view, where you are in between. The third, which I have some sympathy for, that it's malleable, it can be regulated and direction chosen, but the governments are going to be very inefficient in doing this. So I think there's a lot of truth to this, which is that many of these technologies are very difficult to understand from the outside, and the best talent is often not in the government for emerging technologies. So even if it's theoretically malleable, theoretically controllable with the right sort of incentives, government bureaucrats finding those may be very difficult. Now, my argument against this is that this is true in some domains, but not true in others. So for example, if you say this about which particular type of very micro architecture for foundation models should be done, I think it's very difficult for government experts to say, oh yeah, we think mixture of expert models are not good, but chain of reasoning is good. But for broader things like fossil fuels versus renewables, I think that's clear enough and easy enough, and for everybody, even just the democratic citizenry, to have a voice and a perspective on this. The fourth point that I want to sort of point out, which again is not my view, but it's a very, very popular view, all of these worries are second order. They are second order because there is a very strong version of what Simon Johnson and I called in Power and Progress a productivity bandwagon. New technologies are going to increase productivity so much, and then everybody's going to benefit from these productivity benefits. Yes, it may well be true that the direction that Danny wants is slightly better than mine, and if we had a choice, we would choose that of Danny's, but both of them are going to make everybody so much better off. You know, Sam Altman talks of everybody having their own galaxy in the future. So if that's the future we're going to, yeah, the small thing, whether Danny is right or I am right, doesn't really matter so much. Finally, two more that perhaps are really AI relevant. Fifth one, the penultimate one, is AI is different. Whatever I said about malleability of technology and controllability of technology, AI just makes that very difficult. So let me not get into the details of that because I don't want to take more time. But there are arguments of this sort that things that you know about regulating certain technologies cannot be applied to AI. And then the final one, which also is a serious one, and I'll just put it out there, and in the Q&A we can talk about it, international competition. So if any regulation, even if it chooses Danny's better direction relative to mine, has a slowing down effect, and there is a existential international competition, you shouldn't do it, because by doing it, you're passing the leadership to another country, in many of the AI arguments to China. So the previous 5 counter arguments may be all incorrect, but still it may be inadvisable to do AI regulation and trying to steer AI in a different direction, because by doing so, China will, which is not subject to the same kinds of regulation, will take the leadership, and that would be much worse for Americans or their allies. Okay, I'll just stop there and let Danny and Roberto take the first crack, and then we can open it up for discussion.
This is great, Daron. There's so much here, and also it's great that you've also talked about some of the counter arguments that.
So you can give the counter.
In case we agree too much. I want to let me start as we'll return to a lot of these things, but so one thing that it was interesting that one of the first things you put out is the notion that technology and its direction is malleable. And I think we would both agree with Roberto, so we're not going to have a long debate there. But it's interesting because when you were presenting your work on institutions, that was much more about path dependence rather than malleability, although, of course, in the discussion, it came out that there's both room for path dependence and agency. I presume you're coming out pretty much sort of along, in the same way, and then you talk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to just a clarification. Path dependence presumes malleability. So by saying it's malleable, I didn't necessarily mean that's part of the counter arguments, that it's malleable every second. It's malleable once you go sufficiently back. So the malleability of how you develop AI is much less in the US today than it would have been 20 years ago. But yes,
right.
There is still agency.
And you gave some of the examples you gave, for example, how a particular ideological take on technology or particular market structure or business models then set you up on a trajectory then which determines the broad course of technological development and therefore might reduce malleability at any point in time. And so that's so in that sense, I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. There is one big sort of counter argument that you did not mention, which I think in some sense is prior to our debates, because there is a particular type of perspective on the relationship between innovation and institutions that important segments of the tech world articulate, which I think should also be explicitly stated and confronted and debated. Because I think all of us take for granted that market economies and institutions and technology and innovation operates against a background, against a context of a whole series of institutions which both enable broadly economic development and growth and more narrowly technological development and its trajectory. Those things are very much intertwined, but that those institutional underpinnings are fundamental to the functioning of sort of productive market economies and the technologies that they generate. So in that sense, technological innovation and sort of the institutional foundation of markets are complements, that they work together. So the counter argument or the sort of the perspective that actually denies this and which has sort of become sort of a vocally articulated by some parts of sort of Silicon Valley and the tech elite is a return to a kind of libertarianism, which is to say, in fact, that the innovation and technology can best advance in the absence of sort of that institutional context, which is provided in the set of government, its interventions, its investments, and the role in the economy. And in fact, not only that, there is a strong push on the part of this tech elite to want to exit from the
Absolutely.
institutions of the government, which is to say that sort of, let's call this tech libertarianism, if you will, right? I mean,
and, but it's not a new one. It's sort of George Gilder and sovereign individualism
and
from 30 years ago.
It's a continuation of a very sort of long-standing.
But the more
tradition.
sophisticated version of that is essentially what this Matt Ridley book is. So it doesn't deny institutions completely, but it denies any agency, positive agency on the part of government or the democratic process in interfering with innovations.
Right, and a less, sort of maybe less sophisticated version of this would be a purely, exit strategy without sort of, just believing in kind of a pure competitive sort of environment where, but you excise yourself, you extract yourself from, the tax.
So that's the sovereign individual.
Right.
It's an awful
Exactly.
book,
So,
very badly written, but if you're interested, it's by William Rees-Mogg and I forget the other author from about 30 years back.
and I think, sort of, I don't know that we want to necessarily discuss this, but I think it's become with Musk now sort of essentially running so many things in the government, and I think that sort of view has become, I think, very relevant to our current
Yeah,
discussion.
by the way, I actually disagree. That's not Musk's view. Musk's view, I think, has become much more of a...
You know Musk's view of the
Well,
day.
I think Musk's view, at least as I can see it, is much more of a non-libertarian view, where it's much closer to these sort of dark enlightenment neo-monarchism view, that there is a talented group that should rule, which is another sort of very popular opinion in Silicon Valley, for example. Curtis Yarvin, or much more sophisticated version of it by Nick Land, would be versions of that. The founder mode is also sort of part of that.
Right, but so that model does presume that the smarter and the better educated and the more skilled and the more innovative will essentially run everything. And then I think sort of we might come back to it in our discussion next week, which unfortunately not going to be here, and that when then those people are asked, well, what about those who are not part of that circle, then it becomes, okay, maybe we should think about things like universal basic income. And so the whole idea of universal basic income comes again with that kind of, against that background. So the question then becomes, so once we clear that, which is to say that we understand that, we haven't made it, it was implicit in a lot of what you said, but just to make it explicit that, whether it's the intellectual property rights regime, where it is, legal enforcement of contracts, whether it's the employment relationships that are undergirded by sort of, labor law, whether it is the government's investment in the educational system, the science and technology system, the R&D, the support of, research universities, whether it's basic investment in infrastructure. There are so many ways in which, the government, actually makes that tech progress possible, that it's again in the case of Elon Musk, the fact that he had to be bailed out by a government subsidy program when Tesla was at the edge of bankruptcy, the fact that such government programs enable private innovators to take the risks that they take. And those, so that seems to be, critical, but neglected by that perspective. Now, so then moving on then, and I think the question becomes what kind of institutional arrangements would then best produce the kind of, appropriate or, socially optimal mixture of productivity enhancement and distributional outcomes. So what we want to really examine here is really what are the right kind of institutional and legal and policy settings that would regard. And you gave us a lot of reasons to be skeptical that, spontaneously, that we will get the right balance. So I actually wanted here, when we think about what we need to do on the technology front, I did want to show a couple of slides because, it's sort of, if you will, it's a kind of our best guess of what the future labor market is going to look like, and so for whom we want technologies to be developed. So this is just 2 slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I think it's a useful context for our discussion. So the first slide is really about where will people be employed doing what? So this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for the next 10 years of, where will people be employed in 10 years. And these are the occupations that will be the 10 largest occupations in roughly in 10 years, okay? So I want you to look at those. So first one, the largest by far, is home health and personal care aides. Okay, occupational, the education that's required, high school diploma or equivalent. Okay. Second one, fast food counter workers. Third, general and operations managers. That one does require a bachelor's degree. The fourth one is retail, salespersons. Fifth, registered nurses. That also requires bachelor's degree. But none of the others on the top 10 list actually do. So laborers and freight, stock and material movers, stockers and order fillers, sort of large group of warehouse workers, cashiers or cash register operators, customer service representatives, janitors and cleaners, okay? None of those sort of last five require any university education whatsoever. So this is really the largest occupations where people will be. So if you want to ask the question, sort of where will, who do we want to help? Who do we want technology to empower? We'll have to want to think about how technology is going to empower these types of workers. How do we turn, by the way, so we also have the median annual wage here, except for those two occupations that require a bachelor's degree, all of those currently median earnings, median wages are below the US median wage today, which is around $40,000 per person. So you might say, well, maybe this is just too static, doesn't capture how rapidly the labor force is changing. So if you look at instead the change over the last over this 10-year period, which are the occupations that are growing, which are growing to increase the fastest? Not by percentage, because you have some things like solar operators or solar cell construction work that starting from a very low base has been increasing employment very rapidly. But if you basically rank them by the number of jobs that each one of these occupations are going to create, and you put the top 10 first, okay, now you get software developers in the second rank. But still, the list actually doesn't look a whole lot different, because it's still number one, it's still home health and personal care aides, which is going to generate more than double the additional jobs that software will generate, okay? And then the rest are things like cooks and restaurant, again, fast food and counter workers, stockers and order fillers, nurse practitioners. Okay, so even if you look at just how the labor market is changing, so when the question therefore about how do we deploy technology to create a prosperous middle class a society where we create good jobs, these are the kinds of jobs that we will have to essentially productively upgrade to find ways of giving people much higher wage, much higher earning opportunities. A couple of things that are immediately obvious from this to me is one that, as important as IT and software and this whole tech stuff is, that's going to essentially limit, and it's going to be a relatively narrow segment of the labor force, okay? So these people are going to be the users. They will be the users of technology. The second, bigger point is that one of our most oft repeated remedies to the problem of how do we create a prosperous society, that it's more education, that investment in education, right? That's not the answer for this either, because all these jobs are basically jobs that do not require college-level education. That's by investing in creating more Harvards, or even creating a lot of very good technical colleges and investing in STEM. That's not going to answer this problem that the bulk of the labor force is still going to be in these kinds of jobs. So to me, the question of how do you employ these new technologies, whether it's digital tools or AI, is going to be how do we generate the applications that will enable these kinds of people, the home health and personal care aide, the warehouse worker, the cook, the retail salesperson, to empower them to have much greater agency, to do the kinds of tasks that they weren't able to do before, for them to do a wider range of tasks, as Daron has argued, than they were able to do, okay? As well as creating an organizational environment in which they're able to demand for their share of the enterprise surplus that are generated by their work. So it's both organizational changes about bargaining power, but it's also about ensuring that we deploy AI and technologies in applications that are going to be biased towards augmenting the work of these kinds of workers. I think that's the kind of bias that's the most important in my mind in terms of when we think about how do we change, how do we steer technology. Okay? So let me stop here. And then I'll give a word to Roberto, and then maybe we can talk some of the more specific cases and also specific examples of policy as well. But let me stop here.
Let me take the
Yeah, want this?
lapel mic. So in any programmatic argument, in any argument about the future and about alternatives in the future, the two crucial attributes of the argument are first that it marks a direction and that it chooses in the historical circumstance the initial steps by which to move in that direction. And in this spirit, then, I want to distinguish remarks about the short term, the medium term, and the long term. First, the short term. In the short term, the overriding issue, the emergency issue, is the fate and the power of the platform oligopolies. They're most prominent in the United States, where they're the most valuable businesses in the country, but they cast a long shadow over the whole world. And the priority initiative is to disrupt these platform oligopolies and to confiscate what are, in effect, their rents. They have these vast rents which come from the mastery of a unique combination of business models, legal arrangements, institutions, and technological opportunities. In the public mind, they are identified with the knowledge economy, but actually they're not the knowledge economy. They're not characteristic of the knowledge economy. They are an anomaly, dependent on this very particular combination of circumstances. First, they have vast amounts of capital with which they're able to finance the internalization of the technologies that they use. Second, they profit from these network effects, universal platforms. And it's hard to disrupt them simply by applying antitrust law and anti-competition law, because the disruption of the platforms would destroy their value to society and not just their value to their stockholders. Third, they have the advantage of the near zero marginal cost of adding one more customer to the platform. And fourth, those who have developed them have found a way to turn a legal loophole, the non-remuneration of the personal data of their customers, into an economic opportunity. So they make a huge amount of money trafficking in a good for which they pay nothing. So it's not going to be possible to deal with them solely or primarily by antitrust. More promising are the initiatives in the realm of corporate governance and intellectual property. Initiatives that represent the interests of society and their governments, and that make them pay for what they now get for free. Now, the medium term, and it's in the medium term that what I have to say most parallels Danny's and Daron's remarks. So, first, the relation of labor to technology. There are three tendencies now afoot, each of which would have to be interrupted and reoriented. The first tendency is the development of the advanced technologies in the interest of the largest firms. The second tendency is the development of the technologies in a way that replaces labor rather than at the same time replacing and empowering labor. And the third tendency is the conception of the ultimate objective, summarized in the idea of general artificial intelligence, which is the notion that the ultimate objective of the technological evolution is to create a proxy for the human mind, rather than to create something that can assist the human mind on the assumption that the most powerful combination is the partnership of a human being with imagination and a machine. And those disruptions and reorientations can only happen as the result of a combination of certain ideas with democratic politics. The second relation is the relation of labor with capital, labor vis-a-vis capital, rather than labor vis-a-vis technology. And let's distinguish now. In the relations among sovereign states and the economic disparities to the returns to labor among sovereign states, the most important factor is any progress that we can make with respect to the mobility of labor across national frontier. That trumps everything else. And that can only be done through the cooperative arrangements of states, creating compensations for the sending countries, the countries that send labor, and guarantees, safeguards for the countries that receive labor. Within the space of the nation state, which is, after all, the main space, the crucial question is the relation of labor in the vast economic periphery of each national economy to the vanguard of that economy, having a set of linkages that pulls up the rear guard and brings it closer to the vanguard. In a historical period in which the main instrument of the 20th century, which is countervailing power, unionization, has stopped working. And therefore, there must be direct legal intervention in the employment relation to limit the disparities between labor in the capital-intensive parts of the economy and labor in the vast remainder. Imposing something close to a principle of price neutrality. That is, that labor, precarious labor, disorganized labor, which is more and more the majority of the labor force, must be remunerated at a level comparable to the level of labor performed under stable employment relations. And of course, the background of those two movements in the relation of labor to technology and in the relation of labor to capital is the deepening of democracy and the creation of high-energy democracies that would replace the low-energy democracies of today. Daron asked me about the meaning of that, and maybe in our subsequent conversation, we'll have a chance to talk about that. Now, the long term. In the long term, what matters is the legal and institutional architecture of the market order. The emphasis in the 20th century was on the creation of a new form of public law, the law of the redistributive and regulatory state. The emphasis in the 21st century has to be in the recreation of private law, in the basic logic of the regime of property. A market always has these two dimensions. It has the dimension of absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And it has the dimension of the control, the absolute control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. The 19th century property right, the property right created in the 19th century, was based on the assumption that these two dimensions go naturally and necessarily together, but they don't. And in fact, they contradict each other. One of the ways to increase absolute decentralization is to limit the absoluteness or the perpetual character of the control that each of the agents has over those resources, to create rights, claims to resources that are fragmentary, temporary, or conditional. So what should we desire in the future? What we should desire in the future is that the means of production of society, the main resources, should not belong to anyone, neither to individual owners nor to the state, but they should, for example, be vested in social funds, and they should auction off capital to whoever can use it most effectively for a while, until someone else shows up who demonstrates that he can use it better. And this is what one might call capitalism without capitalists. There should always be a role for the traditional property right of the 19th century, because it has an immense advantage, which is to allow someone, the owner, to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in. But what is wrong is to crucify the market, or to nail it to the cross of one particular dogmatic version of economic decentralization. What one should desire is to have a variety of forms. The traditional property right of the 19th century should be one of those forms, but it shouldn't be the only form. And that's what I'm thinking of as the main emphasis of the long-term direction. It was this concern to create a form of the market that would allow the small-scale proprietors and artisans of the 19th century to participate at the productive vanguard of the economy that led John Stuart Mill to develop the legal theory of the joint stock corporation. And it was Karl Marx's belief that it couldn't be done, that it was impossible to reconcile economic vanguardism with limitations of scale, that led to his break with the people that he came to deride as utopian socialists. The future of the knowledge economy lies in the property regime, and in the political affections of the would-be petty bourgeois majority of humanity. I should give you this. Yeah, that works.
Turn it on. No, it works.
Yeah, I have so many questions for you, but maybe maybe Daron has too. But so I understood your short-term, medium-term, and long-term, the components of your agenda, and I hope we can come back to the discussion on democracy, because I think that's also will connect both with our previous discussion, and also I know Daron has been emphasizing the importance of democracy for.
But I don't know what radical democracy is.
So high-energy democracy.
High-energy democracy.
So that I want to come back. So I think that'll be an interesting discussion to have. But before I do that, I mean, your short-term step, sort of when you say disrupt these platform oligopolies, can you say a little bit more concretely? So what does that mean? How do you do that?
So it would be the 21st century equivalent in the United States to the trust-busting movement of the late 19th century that culminated in the Sherman Act.
So what would be, okay?
Having in view that these businesses really are an extraordinary artifact. They're an artificial creation depending on the combination of the four circumstances that I enumerated, and they have to be attacked by unique means. And the means of the late 19th century antitrust are not sufficient.
Okay, so therefore,
Therefore, other means supplementing the partial use of antitrust, such as innovations in the law of corporate governance. So they should be governed in a way that allows the interests of society to be represented in their governance, and by innovations in the law of intellectual property that close the loophole of non-legal excludability, which allows them to traffic for free in the business of in the data of their customers. And those innovations in the law of intellectual property would in turn be the front line, the vanguard of the more radical innovations in the property regime that I took up in the third part of my remarks.
so you go to Amazon, let's say, and now you ask them to pay a fee on the basis
There are
of,
many ways in which this can be structured. Right?
Okay.
There's some element of debate on this, but the basic principle is they shouldn't be able to make a fortune out of nothing. That is to pay nothing for the main instrument, and this is really an accident in legal history that things developed in this way. It's strange. It's a lacuna in the law of property, from which they profit astronomically.
so Daron, I mean, I want to ask you about your thoughts on platform companies. And I think, I mean, there's a sense in which these platform companies are a big disappointment, relative to the promise, right? Because I think one might have thought that the promise of these platform companies would be precisely to enable a lot of small-scale establishments to access consumers and markets, and in a way that precisely allows them to, use these technological opportunities that are provided, just like Uber, had the promise of providing much greater flexibility for a workforce that didn't want to do by 9 to 5, more control over how they're spending their time. And yet the general vibe around these platform companies is not that, sort of they've essentially lifted up the rear guard, to use Roberto's term. So, yeah, but I'm focusing now just for the moment on sort of these platforms and what they're missing and sort of how they would fit into sort of a general.
Well, first of all, I think there is disagreement on this. The view from Harvard Square may be not very much the same as the rest of the US. That doesn't mean the view from Harvard Square is wrong, but a lot of people think, Google is amazing because it's providing all these quote unquote free services on which a lot of people depend. So, in some sense, if you're a weak form of market fundamentalist, you would say these companies are very successful. Their market valuation is 100 times that of Standard Oil when just before it was broken up. Their sales are about 100 times Standard Oil's revenue. Sorry. So whatever they're doing, the market is compensating them for. Now, my perspective on all of this is coming from the direction of technology. So I am most bothered by these organizations because of the fact that I believe, because of the belief that I have, that they are distorting the direction of technology. In addition, they are acting like monopolists in some domains. I think the best one, for example, is very visible, is the ad tech market for Google, which is very heavily manipulated. Google is acting as the intermediary seller at the same time, regulating prices and so on and so forth. But I think the monopoly distortions that they create are pretty small relative to the social costs of where they're steering technology. And at the end of the day, we talk of market steering technology. Well, it's not really the market steering technology. It's it's an ecosystem that is dominated by a few companies that's deciding where technology is going. So my interventions, my favorite interventions, about which I'm not sure because they haven't been tried, there's a lot of uncertainty, but my favorite interventions would be all about changing the market structure in a way that facilitates better directions of technology to emerge. So I think one that, I think there's a lot in what Roberto said that I disagree with, and there are several things that I agree with, but the ones that I would agree with are that the current model of quote-unquote decentralization is not decentralized. So in some sense, I actually think that if Hayek could be objective and was alive today, he would object to the current arrangement because this is not the kind of decentralization that would make the price system a la Hayek work. It's very, very centralized in many different ways.
How do you fix that?
So the way I would fix it, I think, has some similarity to what Roberto was saying, although I'm going to be much more explicit. So one, I think antitrust still has a role. So it's not a completely empty tool, but antitrust by itself is not enough. I think one very important part of it, and again, this is a conduit to redirecting technological change as well, data needs to be priced. So you need to have a data market. Today we have extremely well enforced rules on land. You can not take somebody else's land. You don't have user rights to somebody else's land. Land is like 5% of GDP. Data is much more than that and will become much more than that, but we have no property rights on land. I have data, I can use my own data, you can use my own data, Danny can use my own data, somebody else may be able to monetize it much better. Then this all not only creates part of the rents that Roberto was talking about, but it also creates a completely distorted environment. One of the ways in which it's created a distorted environment is that many of the better directions of AI, for example, those that would amplify the expertise of workers, requires high quality data. So again, let me go back to my electrician example. If you want to create an AI tool that helps electricians be much better in sophisticated tasks, you need a lot of use cases of electricians that are the best electricians in the world doing that thing, documenting it and explaining how they're doing, training models, etc. Well, unless you are paid for that kind of data, nobody is going to go to the trouble of doing that, producing that kind of data. So an environment in which data is not priced actually creates a bias towards the bad kind of AI. So I believe we need a data market, but it cannot be a market in which, just like markets for apples and oranges, where individuals have ownership. So again, this might have some intersection with Roberto, but I think it's a very different type of approach and a very different philosophical place. I don't think you can have an individualized property right on data. And the reason for that is that when I create data, I am influencing not only my own capability to sell that data, but I'm also influencing the value of other people who have similar data. So in other words, data is social, or data creates externalities, and that requires some sort of collective ownership of data. Some people would call that data unions. I don't think that's the right word, but it would do. I think data collectives or data collective ownership would have to be one of the infrastructures. That, by the way, is never going to happen by itself. Governments need to create the infrastructure for that sort of data market and need to allow for that type of collective ownership, which right now I'm not sure, Roberto would probably have more to say on this, but I'm not sure whether it would necessarily clear all the legal hurdles because it's not clear how to actually define those collectives and their rights to exclude people, include people, etc. So that would be somewhere where I think our arguments touch, but I've at least tried to be much more explicit and coming from a very different philosophical place than Roberto.
So I do want to come back to the issue of democracy, both sort of the different senses of democracy, but also, how democracies can manage the kind of policy experimentation that inevitably, these approaches will call. But let me hold off on that for a second and just open it up for comments or questions.
By the way, I also agree that none of this would be possible without some sort of democratic structure. But I'm not sure exactly what types of bolstering things need to be done to make democracies rightly enabled to help with this process.
Okay. Did you have your hand up? Yep. Yeah.
Want to give them the mic or not? Or you can just scream.
Get closer.
I have two questions. The first question is regarding something you have not reached upon on the international sort of side of regulation, because it seems now that when you talk about AI, that's like the Joker argument, saying that it's not an economic issue anymore, it's more of a social security issue now.
National security.
National security.
Sorry, national security is. So if you can expand on that a little bit. And the second question is more theoretical. It would seem that we've not touched more on the a possibility of the state to intervene via tax and transfer regulation, because that would seem to be like the theoretical economic response to this. Don't regulate the thing itself. If you're concerned about the distributional effects, then obviously that would do the work. And if the problems are efficiency-based, then that would not do the work, but that would be better than the state coming and regulating it by itself, because that would cause even more inefficiencies. So,
Okay, we have 40 minutes, 20 minutes for each one of your questions. The first one, I can be relatively brief, actually. I think it's a very, very important topic we need to think much more about. But right now, our discussion is conditioned by the AGI narrative. So if indeed AGI is where we have to head to, and we are going to head very quickly to, then it is only a small distance from that to conclude that whoever reaches AGI or the next step to superintelligence is going to have a huge advantage. And if China and the US are sort of rivals, then it is important that the US reaches this much faster than China. Once you allow for the possibility that there are many, many different directions, AGI is properly construed, is probably not around the corner, then there are things in which both China and US would benefit from. So if China works out a way of doing a better reasoning model, just like DeepSeek R1, US would benefit from that. If US does a way of using AI for better regulating energy consumption, China would benefit from that. And if Canada, China, US, Europe, anybody does a thing that makes workers more productive, that would be both good for US and good for China. So there are directions in which China and US could cooperate. There are going to be directions in which they shouldn't cooperate, but they might end up cooperating. Like China is very clear it's going to use AI for repressive means and for surveillance, and hopefully other countries wouldn't do that, but the evidence is they actually are. So there might be some directions in which you cannot cooperate, but if there are enough directions that are not these deadly competition, then that opens up the way for both international regulation and international cooperation. In terms of your second question, that's an excellent question, both from economic theory point of view and from the public policy discussion. From the economic point of view, many economists would start there. It's sort of a result that's sometimes referred to as the Diamond-Murley's theorem in economics, that you don't want to distort intermediate good consumption or production or usage, or technology usage. So you let the market operate, and then whatever else you want to do, you do that with taxing final goods. That breaks down when there are imperfections, and innovation very naturally introduce a lot of imperfections, both for the reasons that I've articulated and also for the reasons that I didn't have time to get into, but the fact that innovation creates knowledge externalities on others. So I think the Diamond-Merlis theorem doesn't apply here, and from a theoretical point of view, it's not clear it's going to be a case-based thing about what's the best way of doing it. But from a practical point of view, I think my biggest issue with that is what Danny already hinted at. So the most popular versions of that, such as UBI, are neither practical nor desirable. They're not practical because they would not really provide sufficiently generous support for the majority of the population. You know, even today, people like Elon Musk or many others are not willing to put up with a little bit of taxation of their income. You know, what makes you think that once they become even richer and even more powerful, they're going to suddenly give 90% of their income and wealth for financing a generous UBI? But more fundamentally, I think going down that UBI path is also defeatist. It gives up on the prospect of using technology in a more socially beneficial way. It says technology is going to go wherever it's going to go, so it sort of ignores this malleability, or at least steerable malleability. And then finally, I also have another concern with all of these things, that even if they were feasible, even if that was the only thing that we could do, I think they would create a very dystopian society, because humans don't just care about consumption and income, they care about their contribution to society. And if you have a situation in which, say, 5%, 10%, 15% of people generate 99% of GDP, and the remaining 85% live out of transfers, that's going to be a deeply socially unequal two-tier society that would be highly dystopian.
Yeah, I just want to amplify that last point, which I think is very important. I mean, economists have this sense of where people get their satisfaction as just purely consuming goods and leisure, and the work and the quality of work only enters their preferences insofar as it expands their ability to spend more money on goods and more time on leisure. But I think, as Daron said, I think for all of us, really, a lot of our sense of who we are, our sense of identity, and our social recognition is based on what we do. And a lot of that is the work that we do and how we contribute to society. So I think a world in which we downplay that entirely by simply saying, oh, you're out of a job, your job doesn't pay anymore, so here's some transfers from the rest of the society, the real creators, I think would be a very dystopian society. And there's a nice conception here, which a nice contrast between sort of distributive justice and what Michael Sandel here has called contributive justice, which is our notions of distributive justice are based on basically who gets what, as opposed to who gets to contribute what, which is contributive justice. And I think that second dimension of justice is very important, and that's why it becomes very important to think about how we disseminate these new technologies throughout society in a way that actually enables people to contribute to the broader work, to the broader goal of society. So I think that's why it's more broadly important. So other questions, comments? David?
My question is also about national security, but I want to
Speak
push a little bit further. So during the previous wave of globalization, there was a lot of discussion about convergence.
Can everybody hear in the back? Okay, great, sorry.
Will other countries adopt the US economic models? And if we're seeing now potentially a collapse of the global economic order and move to more segmentation of the global economy, then how does that affect regulation of AI? So could, for instance, could there be much more government interest in regulation of AI unless it means a national strategic competition? And could that mean different things in different countries? Could there be the promotion of national champions of regulation reform in the US and China? If Europe doesn't have the AI companies, could it focus more on open source technology? And could that be a very significant in terms of how AI is regulated, in terms of malleability of AI, in terms of how governments seem to shape the direction of AI? That seems to me like it's going to be a very significant factor going forward. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how that might develop.
Excellent question, and I don't think I know the answers, but absolutely, there is more of a fragmented structure. but that fragmented structure will probably require even more intervention from national governments. Certainly, one of the reasons why Europe is behind in AI is that they haven't created a sort of a hub, and I think there is, greater recognition of that now. The recent Paris AI Summit, I think, was very much about that. And if you look at European companies that got their voices amplified during that summit, most of them rely on open source, but they still need an ecosystem, and part of that ecosystem needs to be in Europe. By the way, China actually is much more successful than the US in regulating tech. Not in a way that I favor, and not with objectives that I favor, but China regulates tech very heavily. A lot of the AI companies are dependent on the government data, and often they get their sort of objectives from the government. Tech companies' way of accessing consumers, for example, video games and some online activities, are very much regulated and rather effectively. So the US is the odd one out here in terms of the no regulation. Europe also regulates AI, obviously, but not very successfully. Part of it, the reason I think, is because they don't have a lot of the tacit knowledge that would be required in this regulation, having fallen so far behind.
I just want to say that without adding much to that, we have a session on globalization where these issues will, I hope we'll get back to discuss, because there's a fundamental trade-off here between, the gains from specialization and scale that having a single regime with a single regulatory structure would generate against, sort of being traded off against the possible benefits that each different countries can generate from having very different preferences as to the type of regulations, the type of market structure that they want. And I think ultimately you want to think about this as not desiring one corner as opposed to the other, neither maximizing the economic benefits of scale and specialization, nor maximizing simply sort of the national preferences at the expense of the economic gains. But so where you strike that, inherently is going to be an intermediate one, unless, as again I think Daron rightly said, there is something like AGI where there's really absolute advantage is really what matters, and whoever gets there first is going to eat the whole world, and then then that becomes a very different kind of a structure.
It's not obvious to me whether there's more democratic responsiveness in more globally fragmented systems. There's less of a global straitjacket. At the same time, there are geopolitical incentives you want to prioritize over domestic accountability. So I'm just not sure, in terms of the democratic salience of AI, how that necessarily affects things.
Yeah. So I do want to get back to the question of democracy in the last round here, but just want to see other questions or comments. Yeah.
Yeah, so Rob, I had a question on those tables that you brought. One, does that already, those changes, do they already include assumptions on the change that's going to be caused by automation? And two, it seems like we're looking at positive changes here, and you're saying that those are the people that we'll have to focus on most in terms of enablement, empowerment. But what about negative changes where jobs are just going to, groups of workers are just going to decrease strongly because of those effects?
Right. I mean, I think great questions. I mean, so in principle, they're taking into account, what the existing trends on AI and use of new technologies and so forth. These are from the latest round of projections from the BLS. But of course, there's a wide range of uncertainty there. With respect to sort of job losses, I think that raises a kind of a different set of issues. of how do we deal with the people who are going to be necessarily sort of displaced and so forth. So the point of this was really sort of to project us into 10 years from now, it's the kind of society that we're looking at, and hopefully who we have helped in the meantime to have become more productive and part of a broader set of a middle class. Yep.
I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit more about this idea of Musk as a neo-monarchist rather than just kind of a typical laissez-faire kind of libertarian. Yeah.
I mean, this is perhaps I shouldn't have even gotten into that because that's not my area of research, but you know, I do think that there is a current in Silicon Valley. It's not the only one, and it's not, may or may not be a dominant one, that's quite anti-democratic. And it comes from the view that there are big differences in terms of talent and across the population, and it's sort of an absolute advantage. The more talented should have more say in everything, and that the democratic process prevents and slows down the ability of the very talented to impose the right values on society. And one place you can see this is exactly this founder mode discussion. You know, one place where that came from is that in the sort of the aftermath of the Biden's election and George Floyd and other things, there was a progressive sort of mood in the country. In many corporations, big and small in Silicon Valley, what happened was that there was greater demand from the rank and file to have their voices heard and have a say in major decisions. And that wasn't very welcome. And then the sort of the founder mode was sort of one way to counter that. And Musk throughout was one of the executives who sort of didn't go down that path anyway. When Google, Amazon, Microsoft, etc., for example, went in that direction, Google didn't. I mean, sorry, Elon Musk's companies did not. And I think that sort of belief sort of got stronger, and there are some philosophers that have been sort of pushing that, viewing democracy both as an ineffective form of government with ideas that are sort of, I think, are bastardized versions of Carl Schmitt's ideas, but also sort of combining that with the idea that sort of democracy, because of its weakness, has been captured. So, for example, the kinds of ideas that Curtis Yarvin articulated or took from other philosophers and turned into sort of the cathedral, which means, you know, the NGOs, universities, and the media sort of ruling the United States in a bad way and sort of silencing critics and silencing the real talented people. And it is with that argument that he advocates for a sort of a neo-monarchism. And I think those ideas have been brewing within Silicon Valley and have become stronger and stronger during the last phases of the Biden presidency. And I think part of the reason why some people like Elon Musk and those around them are so enraged by, you know, DEI, for example, you know, not that, you know, that was in any way perfect or well implemented in you know, throughout, you know, academia or any place like that. I'm not defending it, but I think their real beef with that is that they see that as a symbol of that bottom-up constraints on what founders and the real talented people and the real true meritocracy should do. And they have come to the conclusion, at least I think some of them, that democracy is incompatible for that sort of real allocation, effective allocation of talent.
There's an interesting tension there with the economic nationalists in the administration, or the supporters of the administration. Steve.
Well, there's a big divide there.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. That's actually a very behind the scenes, at least from what I hear from people who are much more in the know. It's really a hugely acrimonious.
Steve Bannon has called Musk and the people around him the techno-feudalists,
Exactly.
which is this notion of you know,
Him and Yanis Varoufakis, that's right.
There was one more, David?
So the three interventions mentioned institutions that have to be reinvented in the long term, how existing institutions, practices, and structures condition the direction of technology, and how innovation is related to institutions. But the base in which institutions cannot adapt to the pace of technological change sort of questions the very foundation of presuppose that there is something that is sustained, that there are culture, practices, and things that are sustained for a relative period of time. And in that vacuum, because democratic institutions cannot adapt to the technological change, those who own these companies are setting institutions on their own figures that replicate them. So my question is, how do we see then the role of democracy in this when the whole set of institutions that encompass democracy represent the appears a challenge for technological change as it is directed by the oligopolies that Professor mentioned?
So that's a great segue to our sort of the discussion I did want to have on sort of, you know, the role of democracy in all of this. So I want to go back to first Roberto and ask him to just elaborate a little bit on his concept of democracy and high energy politics.
Yeah.
And all
So,
that. But before and then to Daron to ask the question of whether is it in fact possible for democracies to do this, which is, you know, you mentioned one of the counter arguments was the impossibility to regulate technology, especially when technology is changing so rapidly and capturing the institutions, and when we know so little about what kind of regulation would work, so we need to experiment. Our democracy is capable of engaging that, and so if you can say a few things about that, but first.
So the contrast, so I start from the premise that all the existing democracies are weak democracies. The democracy of the United States in particular, because it is an 18th century democracy, is a kind of proto-democratic liberalism. But all of them have this character. And the distinction between higher or lower energy democracy can be made with respect to the direction and with respect to the attributes, the institutional innovations. So the direction. A high energy democracy is a democracy that first creates trouble for the class system. All the existing democracies establish a coexistence of the class structure of society with political democracy. And the high energy democracy, rather than having a passive attitude toward the class structure, multiplies opportunities for the subversion of the class structure. Second, a high energy democracy is a democracy that effaces, that weakens the influence of path dependency, the power of the past over the future. Third, a high energy democracy compared to a low energy democracy is a democracy that overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. And fourth, a high energy democracy is a democracy that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis. So in all these flawed, weak democracies that exist, the rule is no trauma, no transformation. You need a war or you need an economic collapse for anything to change. The extreme example of that is Europe in the 20th century. Now, then the second criterion are the institutional innovations. So the first set of institutional innovations required by high energy democracy are innovations that elevate the temperature of politics, that is, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. The premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that democracy must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. That is, at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. The premise of the high energy democracy is that this is false. The different political arrangements differ in the temperature, in the level of mobilization. The second set of institutional innovations are innovations that accelerate the tempo of politics. Rapid resolution of impasse through engagement of the general electorate in the resolution, as opposed to slowing down. So, for example, in the American constitutional arrangements, there are two principles, two architectural principles. A liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, Madison's scheme of checks and balances. The partisan of a high energy democracy would say, reaffirm the liberal principle, but get rid of the conservative principle by creating mechanisms that accelerate the temperature, that accelerate the pace through the rapid resolution of impasse.
Are there any examples of high energy democracy, such as?
It's a question of degree. And so the third set of institutional innovations are innovations that want to combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with the power of parts of a country, for example, in a federation, to deviate from the dominant solutions and create counter models of the national future. So in other words, a dialectic of experiments, dominant and recessive experiments. Those innovations, added to others, are what define then a high energy democracy.
Would another concrete illustration of high energy democracy would be frequent referenda on policy?
Well, that's one of the instruments of the raising of the temperature, right?
What's an example of, in this degree, of a high energy democracy?
Well, all of the constitutions of the 20th century, the post-Weimar constitutions, are relatively higher energy democracy than the extreme example on the other side, which is the United States. So the United States, the Americans think their Madisonian Constitution is a kind of safeguard, a foolproof safeguard against South American caudillismo. Now they're discovering the opposite. It's a binary structure, which is either lowers the temperature and prevents agitation, but then when it's overridden, when there's an overflowing popular energy, it becomes the opposite. And it's entirely inept to restrain the excesses of caudillismo. That's the example of low energy democracy.
So I wonder, I just want to have one quick response before we go to Daron, but I wonder both in your sort of preference for this high energy democracy with, and in your previous discussion of a long-term market economy approach that, for example,
Reinvents the market.
that reinvents the market, sort of, slices and dices property in a sort of,
Yes.
in a fragments it. You have the capital stock.
With the important proviso that that not be the only way, that that be just one way. Because the most important thing is that the market order not be pinned to a single version of itself.
Right. So you don't want to say that this is the only thing you want to happen. You're using this as an example of things that might happen.
And actually, I think that would probably be the predominant form.
Right.
Because, but the
but
guarantee of absolute property.
So my worry is that I think, both in the political and the economic sphere, you're underestimating the importance of a certain amount of stability and predictability and long-term investment horizons for what the impact would be. So if I'm an entrepreneur or an inventor, I think there is a referendum every week. My government is constantly experimenting with certain things. And then, my capital stock can be, taken away by the auction on Friday because somebody is going to, bid for a higher. I have a
I
little
think
bit of.
that I disagree with what the likelihood of empirical risk is. I think that under these arrangements, for example, for rapid resolution of impasse, suppose, for example, under the American Constitution, you have an arrangement that says either of the political branches facing an impasse between the executive and the legislative could unilaterally have the right to call early elections. But the exercise of this right would always have to be bilateral. So the branch that calls the early election has to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. Now, my supposition is that under that arrangement, which is in a sense is a radicalization of the arrangements of the French Fifth Republic, the prerogative of dissolving the impasse would be used too rarely rather than too often, just the opposite.
So it doesn't serve your purpose.
No, it does serve the purpose to some extent, but I just think that the balance of risk is not on the side where you're located, which is the side of perpetual flux.
Sounds to me like Trotskyite democracy.
No.
Permanent revolution.
No, it's not permanent revolution. It's to have a simple metaphor. If a building is designed to be able to sway in the wind so that it's less vulnerable to be destroyed by an earthquake, does that mean that it's more stable or less stable? That means that it's more stable. And that's the nature of these arrangements. The idea is not permanent revolution. The idea is to make structural change banal, to make it easy, to cut it down to size, so they can come in little fragments.
And in a day and age where, sort of the world's wealthiest individual is running, sort of havoc with the federal government, you don't have greater admiration for Madisonian checks and balances?
No, I think they don't work, and the present circumstances are showing that they don't work. That's why I referred to the overriding of Madison by Caudillismo. So we have that experience in Latin America. You take the American-style federalism and presidential arrangements, you project them into a social and cultural situation of hyper-politics and hyper-mobilization, and they turn into the opposite. That is, the President Cardenas Vargas Perón arrived in power promising the sky to the masses. Then he finds his hands tied by the constitutional. What do you think is going to happen? It's not what the architects of the American Constitution intended.
For what it's worth, in the book Narrow Corridor that James Robinson and I wrote, we start somewhat similar places, Roberto, that these constitutions and Madisonian checks are not super effective. But then I think we diverge, reflecting probably Roberto's much more revolutionary outlook and our much more conservative outlook, that you need to form a balance between sort of bottom-up forces and top-down state capacity and order.
So I think that it's important to introduce into this conversation another theme of our earlier discussion, which is the social situation. And I want to insist on my thesis of the petty bourgeois, which you disliked because of the word, I think. But
well, I don't know what it means.
So I'll tell you what it means. I think that the majority of people now in the world are poor, but their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. So what do they want? They want a small farm, a shop, a trade for which they can charge a fee. So their default aspiration is the petty bourgeois aspiration.
To be masters of their own
for
fate.
there to be,
Which was true in the 18th century too.
Yes, and it has been true all throughout. But in the long period of the 19th and 20th century, all of that began to seem archaic, because the idea was the future belonged to these large organizations, factories, corporations, and so forth. Now we see that that's not the case, and that this world of the fragmented individuals comes back. And so the question is, what's going to happen with them? How can they be?
But except that I think in the 18th century, it wasn't the world of fragmented individuals. It was often community-based.
Yes, the old corporations of the aristocratic regime.
Or what E.P. Thompson would have called the moral economy.
Yeah, they decay, and now there's this world in which the majority of the labor force is first condemned to some form of make work under the regime of the insular knowledge economy, and then relegated to precarious employment in the secondary part of the labor market. That's the world that has to be dealt with. And as long as those people, this subjective petty bourgeois that's not a part of a small business class, but that subjectively thinks of itself as wanting to be, as wannabe petty bourgeois, they then become the basis for the right-wing movements in the world. And that's been so since the middle of the 20th century. That was a fatal mistake made by the European left in electing this class its enemy. Then they became the basis of fascism, of Nazism, and so forth. And now they're the basis of what's happening in the United States.
I broadly agree, except I don't like the term petit bourgeois, but,
Well,
but,
can't help
but
it.
that doesn't matter, so it's just a term, so. But last 5 minutes, Darren, I wanted you to speak a little bit about sort of how your conception of democracy can handle.
Well, I think I will say a few words about democracy, but I'm not sure whether I will answer your question, because, you know, I am convinced that democracy is superior to other ways of governing complex economies, and that what we're talking about is most feasible or is only feasible under democracy. But on the other hand, I think it is true that over the last 3 decades, 4 decades, democracy has failed. And whether that's failure is a function of some inherent weaknesses of the way that democracy was conceptualized, which I think is what Roberto is arguing, or whether because democracy betrayed its conceptualization, I think is the big debate. So failure, I think democracy, you know, in my conceptualization, democracy promises 3 things, and it has failed in all 3 of them in various different ways. First of all, it promises shared prosperity. Second, it promises good, decent public services, including education, roads, plumbing, the right type of regulation. And third, it promises voice. And I think in all 3 of those, it has failed. You know, inequality has increased a lot, especially in the United States, but also in the UK, to some extent in several other countries, depending on what measure of inequality you look at. Democracies have become awful in the inefficiency in which they provide their public services. I think that's actually, despite the fact that Americans criticize Europe, actually the worst offender there is in the United States. In every domain, the inefficiency of the government sector has become just incredible. Like if you look at things where you can measure the efficiency, like road building, repairs, buildings, costs have increased more than 3-fold in 3 decades without any major increase changes in inputs or anything like that. And it's all very done essentially by bad forms of regulation and bad forms of activism that got bundled into the regulation, and the quality of public services has just, you know, dropped. And then finally, I think a significant fraction of the population feels they have no voice. In the United States, 85% of the people answered a Pew poll a year and a half ago that politicians don't care like what people like me think. You know, okay, fine, you can blame Fox News or social media, but it's, you know, I think you should blame democracy. I mean, you know, of course, there's a lot of propaganda everywhere, but if we have come to that level, that's just a blatant failure of democracy. Now, it's clear a democracy of this sort, whether this is what Roberto means by a low energy democracy or not, I don't know, but a democracy of this sort could not take on the additional task of redirecting and steering technology or dealing with the most powerful corporations by far that humanity has ever seen. So the question is whether you need fundamental reform, some different aspects of democracy, or whether democracy was captured by a globalized metropolitan elite that really doesn't care about the working class, and that's the fault, that's the problem, or is it something else? I think those are very, very important questions that we need to debate, but it's clear that there's a big failure there.
So I want to end on a bit of more of an upbeat note on democracy, since this is a little bit depressing. But first I would say, you know, in response to what you said, Darren, without disagreeing with you, it's not clear what the counterfactual is. It's not the case that authoritarian regimes have done better. And
Absolutely.
by the way, I would include China in there too. You know, unless you take a very, very narrow perspective. So it's not, maybe there is something.
But there's one difference. Democracy builds much better aspirations, much greater aspirations. That's the important.
That is true, and as it
should.
But I mean, authoritarian regimes also claim to deliver. So they're supposed to have, you know, sort of what is called the outcome legitimacy, right? And they don't, as of course your own work shows. But I want to say just a couple of words more narrowly on the ability of democracies to handle the kind of regulatory experimentation that is required. So I don't think we have a lot of good examples dealing with sort of these new technological trends, so that's still a bit of a question mark. But I don't think it's generally the case that democracies have had a disadvantage in engaging in regulatory experimentation and the kinds of policies that would steer technologies in the right direction. I think the U.S., for the vast, history, its own economic history is actually provides a lot of good examples as how a democracy has managed this, whether it's at the federal level, with its various technological innovation programs, DARPA, NSF, NIH, and more recently its clean energy programs and so forth. Lots of experimentation there, lots of what today we call industrial policy, which normally the U.S. is not supposed to have engaged in, but also locally, significant amount of experimentation. The U.S. is a decentralized environment. There's actually has been historically much more industrial policy at the local level in the United States, so much more experimentation than at the federal level. It hasn't been always successful, but there is actually a lot of local experimentation at the municipal level, at the state level, so taking place in a democratic context. It's not just the US. Probably my best example of experimental industrial policies or innovation policies outside the US in a democratic context is post-Pinochet Chile, where you think about that as a very market-oriented kind of economy, but they've engaged in, through a particular institution, the Fundación Chile, which operates like a quasi-public venture fund, essentially, steering technology in new directions and promoting non-traditional exports, have had critical successes, all within a broadly democratic structure. So there are examples. It's not just sort of, China that can do experimental industrial policy. It's not authoritarian Korea and Taiwan before they became democratic. So those are some examples that we should keep in mind. But there is, against this background of our democracies currently, obviously, are going through a very tough time. So next week, I think, it's going to be on inequality specifically. And then we'll have Daron back in a couple of weeks for a final time. Thank you, Dagender.
Thank you, Dan.